Hello, I'm Kathy Smith, host of the podcast Fascinated by Shipwrecks. In this episode, we're covering the ill-fated last voyage of the steamship SS Valencia. She sank on January 22nd, 1906, off Panchina Point on Vancouver Island during what should have been an easy milk run from San Francisco to Seattle. Tune in as my guest Rod Scher and I delve into some of the surprising details of how the ship came to wreck in an area known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. I am very excited today to be welcoming Rod Scher to the podcast. He is the author of several maritime-oriented books, and one of his latest books is The Ship of Lost Souls, The Tragic Wreck of the Steamship Valencia. And this is really quite a tragic tale, but it's got some really interesting and fascinating things going on around this ship at the time that it sinks. And it sank just off the west coast of Vancouver Island in January of 1906. So this was the days before the Titanic. It was the days before a lot of stuff started to happen with radio communications, and ensuring the safety of vessels and people on board. So I'm very excited to welcome you today, Rod.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I guess my first burning question is, what what made you decide to write about this particular shipwreck?
Well, I guess there are a couple of reasons. One is just geography. I happen to live on the central coast of Oregon in Depot Bay. So I'm sort of smack in the middle of what had come to be known as the graveyard of the Pacific. So I'm kind of surrounded by shipwrecks. And so it's sort of natural. We can, when we travel, we run into reminders of shipwrecks along this coast all the time. One of which, for example, is the Peter Iredale, and you can go visit the beach where it ran aground. And of course, there's a little less of it every year because it disappears. But so it's just sort of the nature of where I live. But in addition to that, the publisher I work with most often really likes shipwreck stories. Uh, I'm not sure why, other than, I guess I am sure why, because they're built-in tragedies. They have their own built-in narrative arc, and it's very dramatic. You know something terrible is going to happen, so it becomes, incumbent upon the writer to find a compelling way to tell that story, even though the reader sort of knows where the story's going. It's not going to end well. It could range anywhere from being a major inconvenience to a true tragedy. And in the case of the Valencia, it really was a tragedy. So I had written a book called Sailing by Starlight, which is the story of a geography professor who sailed around the world with no instruments. He didn't even, no compass, no sextant, nothing. Didn't even take a wristwatch. And so that book was pretty well received. And the publishers said, "So what are you going to do for a follow up?" And I said, "Well, we have all these shipwrecks." And they go, "Oh, good. We love shipwreck stories." So I pitched six stories actually, five of which were shipwrecks. And the acquisitions editor with whom I work, she really liked this one, the story of the Valencia. And so, she took it back to her marketing team, and they poked at it and grunted and whatever it is they do, and decided that that was a great story. It was worth telling, and it is. It's a great story, tragic story. It's very sad, um, and mainly I think because it was so unnecessary. Then again, I suppose that's the nature of tragedies. They tend to need not have happened, but because people made a series of mistakes, in this case, mainly, but not just the captain made mistakes. Um, it happened, and looking back at it, it's easy to see why it shouldn't have happened. But then, we weren't there. So maybe we would not have done any better. I probably would not have.
Yes, ultimately it's when we see it, decades later, read about the story, you do kind of think, I wish I was there and could just have steered the ship a different way or
Yeah.
done something else to be able to help them. You kind of feel like there's that you are there, especially in your book, because it's so well written. It's so descriptive of the time that they're going through, that these people are going through. And you can just imagine how every single person aboard that ship has been affected during that wreck event. So maybe you can tell us just a little bit about the ship itself, where it began, and what its original intention was before she ended up going along the West Coast.
Yeah, Valencia was not intended to be a West Coast ship. She was an Atlantic vessel. She made runs in the Caribbean. She ran soldiers down south for the Spanish American War. She was built for that kind of environment, warm water mostly. Um, and when she came by the time she arrived on the West Coast, she was already kind of old and weather beaten. And she was not designed for the sort of weather we think of when we think of the Pacific Northwest, cold, damp, stormy. The Pacific, for people who don't live near the Pacific, they may not realize that there's nothing peaceful about it. It's a really violent place. There are terrible, terrible storms, partly because the Pacific Ocean is so large. It's the largest, not just the largest ocean, it's the largest geographic feature on Earth. And because of that, the wind can whip through terrifically long stretches of the ocean. I guess sailors would call that a fetch. And the waves can build. And that's one of the reasons storms, when they occur on the Pacific, can be so violent. Um, Valencia was not made for that kind of thing. In addition, she was pretty narrow of beam. Her bow was positioned very far forward of the helm, the pilot house, so that a lookout posted out there on the bow, especially in the dark and during a storm, and with the crashing of waves and that sort of thing, you're not going to be heard very well. So the ship was ill suited. She was beat up. She was old. It's kind of cruel, actually, but somebody called her at that time a second class ship under the command of a second class captain, which I thought was, rude. Probably true, but still kind of rude. Um, she was old and battered when she began this what was supposed to have been a very brief journey.
And she was about 252 feet long, I believe, at
I
the
think that's
time.
about right. Yeah.
Yes.
So that may sound large
Hmm.
to us, but it's pretty small as ocean liners go, especially these days, of course. But she was just not meant for this environment, and it's kind of too bad that she had to end her days. I suppose it's sad when any ship has to end its days, but especially sad when so many human lives are taken with her.
Right. So she had approximately 136 people, crew and passengers aboard.
Correct. And we're not 100% sure. In those days, we're talking 1906. Um, manifests were not kept as rigorously as we might keep them today. People got on board at the last minute. In any case, the most up-to-date manifest would have gone down with the ship. So we're not 100% sure, but that's the generally accepted number, 136 people. And some of those people had very interesting stories. And that's kind of, you mentioned earlier that in the book I was talking about things that were happening around the environment as this ship was undergoing its tragic demise. I think that's important. I think adding that kind of context makes for a much more informed reader. I think the reader understands more about this particular tragedy, partly based on what's going around the tragedy at the time. Um, so I guess that's it for that.
Well, so maybe you can say a little bit about that. So, around that time, there wasn't, and of course, where she ends up wrecking is completely remote and sort of way off base of where she should have
Mhm.
been on her route from San Francisco to Seattle. So maybe you could plan out the route for us and why she was commissioned to do that particular voyage.
Sure, that was supposed to be kind of a milk run, what we would call a milk run today, I guess. A 3-day trip, mostly within sight of the coastline, sailing northward, and then turning east into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And the problem was, for a number of reasons, the captain missed that turn. Um, that was not a very smart thing to do. And the reasons he missed it, contributed to this tragedy. But the fact is that he missed that turn and continued on, heading directly toward a pretty remote section of the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is where they ran aground. And as places to shipwreck go, that's about the worst, um, because there's nothing there. And there's still nothing there. If you want to visit the site, if you want to stand up on the cliff and overlook the site where the ship ran aground, you have to hike 18 kilometers along the West Coast Trail. And when you get there, there's nothing there except a pair of the very nice red Adirondack chairs that the government puts some places that are worth looking at in their national parks and such. Um, when the ship ran aground there was nothing there and no one there to help them. They could not have picked a worse place to run aground. And then they went about, trying to resolve that issue, and really they got themselves into more trouble.
But this was during a storm event as well, right? So the storm
Yeah,
is partly why they've drifted off course. And then when you say nothing was there, what do you mean by that?
I mean, there were no settlements of any size anyway. In fact, it was so remote and they were so disoriented that most of them did not realize that they had run aground in Canada. They thought they had run aground in the United States. That's how disoriented they were. Um, there was no beach to run aground on. I mean, they hit the rocks, and during this, between the storm and the rocks and the waves, the ship was just torn to shreds over a period of about 3 days. A few people, 18 actually, two different parties of 9 people eventually got to the shore, but it's probably important to keep in mind that there was no shore in the sense of a beach or anything. It was just rocks. And it was not safe on those rocks. And people were killed many people were killed by being battered against those rocks and then falling into the water and drowning if they were still alive. There was a cliff, about 100-foot cliff, and both groups at different times managed to scale those cliffs and climb up. And when they got to the top, there was nothing there except a trail. And it was just barely a trail. Right now, it's part of the West Coast Trail and it's been much improved. But then it wasn't a whole lot more than a game trail, meant at the time to help people service telegraph lines, which in the bad weather were always coming down. So two groups at different times climbed to the top. This is the point at which yet another critical error was made. The two groups, one went east and one went west, understandably, looking for help. In reality, and again, we're looking back at it, hindsight being 2020 and all, they should have stayed there, or they should have at least left a person or two to stay there, because when they dropped off in different directions looking for help, which they eventually found. Back on the ship, the captain and his crew, they had what's called a Lyle gun, which is a small cannon meant to shoot line. And you shoot the line either from the shore to the ship or from the ship to the shore. And then you use that line to transfer goods, including people. So they could have used that Lyle gun to transfer people from the ship to the shore, except that there was nobody on shore to make fast those lines because those two groups had left. And, without knowing it, that was a terrible mistake to have made. But I mean, how are they to know? And remember that they were under the worst kinds of duress. It was cold, it was wet, their clothes were shredded, they were bleeding. Many of them had lost their shoes, and now they were off on a cross country hike. So it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, what they should have done is this. But in reality, could we have acted that intelligently under that kind of pressure? I'm kind of doubted, though.
Yeah. So that's a pretty precarious situation, of course.
Yeah, it's a
And
terrible.
and so maybe we can just backtrack a little to Captain Johnson. What can you tell us about him?
Well, he was nobody's fool. You don't get to be the captain of a ship, even a second class ship, supposedly, um, by being a fool. But he made a series of mistakes. He'd been a seaman since he was 14 in the Swedish Navy. This was not something new to him. He'd basically grown up in the Maritime. He knew what he was doing, and yet he made a series of errors that, looking back at them, they're kind of astounding. To begin with, he didn't have any lifeboat drills, what they might call a muster drill these days. And you have to do that, and you have to do it early in the voyage because later on may be too late. And even today, if you take a cruise, I don't know if you've ever been on a cruise, but when you, sometime in the first 24 hours of the cruise, you're going to be called to muster stations, and there you're going to be instructed, and the crew re-instructed, where to gather, how to gather, how to deploy the lifeboats if they're necessary. Hopefully, of course, they won't be, but you never know. Um, he never did that. And he had a 3-day journey ahead of him. He should have done it in the first day. So as a result, when it did come time to deploy the lifeboats, it was just chaos. Nobody knew what they were doing. Half the crew had not been on that ship before. They had transferred over from a sister ship. So they weren't even sure where the muster stations were. Lifeboats are still, and it certainly were in those days, complicated devices to deploy. You have to know what you're doing. And the passengers got in the way, and they panicked, as they would. They started just hacking with knives at the ropes that held the lifeboats on the davits, which is not a good way to deploy a lifeboat. So basically, the lifeboats that did get deployed, almost all of them broke up or capsized immediately. And that's partly because Captain Johnson didn't do his job correctly. He did not call for lifeboat drills. That's probably the first mistake he made, but it's the first in a long line of mistakes that he should have known better. He had people on watch, but he had them on watch for 6 to 9 hours at a time. That's a very long time to have someone posted, say, on the bow of a ship in the middle of a storm in the dark and have them stay alert. Mostly what most people would curl up and go to sleep somewhere after 2 or 3 hours, and the investigating committee said that well, that was one of the mistakes he made, because 2 hours is about the maximum a person could be expected to stand effective watch in that case. So so that was another mistake he made. Maybe one of the most important or disastrous, I guess, mistakes he made was he had a device called a log, not a book in which you write things, but a log is a mechanical device that you throw overboard and a propeller is attached to it and it spins and it's able to tell you how fast you're going. He felt that it was underrunning, that it was telling him he was going faster than he really was. Um, but in reality, he was going as fast as the device said he was, and he should have trusted his instruments. That's one of the things they tell airplane pilots these days is you can get easily confused and rattled. Don't rely on your gut. Rely on your instruments. Learn to trust them. He didn't have a lot of instruments, but one of the ones he did have was that log, and he didn't trust it, and he should have, because between that and another thing he didn't know about, which was the current, he was moving much faster than he thought he was, which is why he passed the eastward turn onto the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
That's a lot. Just
It is. It's a,
that's a
it's a,
lot just in itself. Never mind the actual wrecking event.
yeah.
So
All this to occur on top of a storm and completely not understanding where he was. I mean, he literally did not know where he was. And you would think that it's among the captain's prime directives to at all times know where your vessel is.
yes, yes, and so there was sort of the ship was doomed before it left, sort of when you think about it in those terms. And I think there was another remark that you had mentioned about Captain Johnson. This wasn't really his this area in the Pacific Northwest was not something that was familiar to him.
No, this was only his second time making this particular trip from San Francisco to Seattle or Victoria and on and on. Um, and that became part of the issue because his previous trip had been in the summer. And in the summer, there's a current that runs along that area called the Davidson Current. It's actually part of a larger current called the California Current, but it tends to flow either very weakly or southward during the summer. But during the winter, it tends to flow much more strongly and it tends to flow northward. So the current was also pushing him faster. Um, Much like a pilot, again, airplane analogies seem to fit here. Um, Flying in a jet stream or with a tailwind, your
Mhm.
ground speed is much faster than you think it is. His ground speed, if you want to use that term, was much faster than he thought it was, and he should have trusted his instruments because he did not know about the current, and he should have known about the current. It was on the charts. the The Davidson current was well studied and well known even in 1906, so he should have known this.
And I don't believe he had those charts with him, right?
We can't be sure. They talk about having some charts, but either he didn't have the charts. That's the general consensus, is that he didn't have those charts with him. But if he did have them, he ignored them. So it's that's not as likely though, because he did have other crew, a first and second mate. They would have pointed out to him on the chart. Of course, he did also ignore the second mate when the second mate told him, I think that the log is actually accurate and we are moving at the speed it indicates. We are moving faster than you think we are moving, sir. I
Mhm.
assume I assume he said sir.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the passengers. I know you've sort of singled out several in the book and how their lives were affected by and this tragedy. Obviously, everyone's life was affected, but certain
Yeah.
particular people stood out as far as, trying to go ashore to get help or help in other ways.
I think my favorite passenger and it's not because I like him, but I actually don't think I do like him, is a man named Frank Bunker, who was a teacher and then a school administrator and became an author writing books on education. And this was after the the wreck. And he paints himself as something of a hero because he led the one of the groups, the what came to be called, in fact, the bunker group of 9 men who climbed to the top and set off to find some help. He's um, he's not a likable man, I don't think, but he's intelligent, as you assume he would be, being a teacher and administrator and a writer and all those sort of things. He suffered greatly, and I have to keep in mind when I think that he acted sort of imperiously, ordering other people around and sort of becoming the de facto leader of his group. This is a man who watched his wife and child die in front of him only hours before. I can't presume to know what that would feel like. And if he's a little pushy and a little imperious, I think I said, um, and he's a little condescending when he speaks to other people, nonetheless, he did lead that group to, it turns out to have been a cabin that contained supplies, not much in the way of supplies, but some meant for people who were out on the trail fixing the telegraph line, including what essentially was a telephone slash telegraph that he used to contact people at the nearby lighthouse. So I I'm not sure that I would have wanted to like go hiking with him, but you do have to give the man credit for accomplishing what he did. There were other people. There was a Greek seaman on board who he was a brave guy. He at one point when all appeared to be lost, he just tied a rope around his waist and leaped into the water to try to swim to shore. He had to give up about halfway, and they pulled him back using the rope, I guess. And he apologized and wept and was, you know, torn because he was unable to help the people. But he did survive. Actually, he ended up in another group that survived. And interestingly, he sort of made a fairly decent living afterwards, going around um, to different gatherings and telling the story of the shipwreck and of how he survived. And I suppose, and he gave swimming exhibitions, which I suppose was part of showing how he leaped into the water and tried to save everybody, but failed. Uh, but I think I like that guy more than Frank Bunker myself.
Yeah, well, I guess under duress, certain personality quirks, if I can even use that name in this context, may come to the fore,
For better or worse, I suppose.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's going on in society around this time and why there is no infrastructure around life saving and lighthouses and that kind of thing. And I know that you talked quite a bit about radio communications in the book as well.
Yeah, there were some technologies that were sort of up and coming at the time that would have helped. At least I think they would have helped. Radio is one of them. There were wireless radios on some ships at the time. This was 1906, but it was kind of haphazard. I think there were only 40 or 50 ocean liners that had wireless on them, and they were not the second class ships. They were the big ocean liners, like the Titanic, which sank a few years later, and many people were saved because they had radio. In this case, a lot of it comes down to money. The ship, the Valencia, did not have a radio because it was not worth it in the sense of making that kind of expenditure on an old beat up ship. A few years hence, partly because of the Titanic, all the ships, at least over a certain size, carrying over a certain number of passengers, would have radios. There was very little life-saving infrastructure, and again, that's probably because of money. The east coast of the United States, for example, got a lot of lighthouses and life-saving stations. There was no Coast Guard yet, but the groups that would eventually grow up to become the Coast Guard had life-saving stations, spotted along the coast. But that's mainly the east coast in the U.S. On the west coast, more sparsely populated, not as much commerce. Again, that means not as much money. Um, so they respond, I guess, then as now, to a perceived commercial advantage to investing that kind of money in infrastructure. It's too bad, of course. There were a few lighthouses. Again, they're expensive to build. They're expensive. Well, at least they were expensive to maintain, um, and for the same reasons. There were a few around, but not enough to do any good. There were life-saving stations, but none around the area. It was, like I said, that they picked about the worst area they could to wreck a ship. There was nothing there to help them.
Yeah, that is one of the sad and poignant parts of this story. But there's also an interesting sort of unexpected story around lifeboat number 5.
There is, and that gave rise to a whole bunch of slightly eerie, otherworldly kind of interpretations of that. What happened was about, I think it was 26, maybe 27 years after the wreck, uh, the lifeboat, that particular lifeboat, which had been launched but capsized and floated off, suddenly reappeared in, I think it was Barclay Bay, floating around as if nothing had ever happened. There was a nameplate on it, Valencia, lifeboat number 5, still perfectly readable. Um, that the plate from the lifeboat was taken off, and it is now at the museum in Victoria. I went and saw it and took pictures of it. Actually, to be fair, my wife took pictures of it, I guess. Um, and it's interesting to hold something like that in your hand. Uh, a reminder of a tragedy and of the very real people's stories that all of whom, most of whom, died in that ship or in the water surrounding that ship. Um, People made up these stories about how the lifeboat itself was haunted and it had come back to visit and that sort of thing. Most likely, what happened, at least the rationalist in me says, is that he got blown into a sea cave somewhere and stayed there for 26 years until another storm occurred and a surge washed it back out and it floated into Barclay Bay. Um, that's pretty much the only reminder we have of the ship. So
I can imagine how eerie that must have been when people first spotted it, though.
it must have been, and at that time, 26 years later, the memory had started to fade, but there were still people around who remembered it, and perhaps people who knew people who had perished on the ship. It's funny, when I went to Vancouver Island, um, one of the reasons I went is because I wanted to talk to people who may have had, they wouldn't have had their own recollections, but there might have been family stories passed on about the wreck and great uncle Joshua who perished on the ship or whatever. Nobody on Vancouver Island remembers this story. And I thought that was very strange until I was talking to a man there who said, well, most of the people that live on Vancouver Island don't come from Vancouver Island. They came from the mainland, or they came from the US, or they came from wherever. Um, it's kind of like talking to people in Los Angeles. Nobody lives in Los Angeles who actually came from Los Angeles. So
True enough. Um, Now, where can you just pinpoint for us exact spot where the ship wrecked?
it's um, it's pretty much in the middle of the coastline of the west coast of Vancouver Island. Um, there's an Indian village there. Well, back then it was an Indian village called Clo-oose. I may have mispronounced that, but like I said earlier, it's about 18 kilometers in from make it 20 or 25 kilometers in down from Victoria.
So,
Not easy to get at.
no. So, of the approximate 136 passengers, I think there were about 37 people who survived.
Correct.
And so, did you follow the stories of the survivors?
As best I could. Most of them just disappeared. There
Mhm.
were the two groups of nine who both made it to areas where they could contact people and ask for help. The bunker party and the other party. Um, and then there was a not a life boat, but a life raft with another 18 or maybe 19 people on it. Um, they were picked up by a cruising ship that was out looking for survivors. Um, but I couldn't find a whole lot. I mean, I think I listed, six or seven people, uh, and told the story of each of them as best I could, briefly, because mostly they just disappeared back into their regular lives. Very few of them, with the exception maybe of Frank, um, did anything that was worth noting, at least in the newspapers of the day.
And there is a particular cemetery that is dedicated to, right?
There's a site at the cemetery in the Queen Anne area of Seattle, um, and there's I guess what you'd call it, a gravestone erected over the site of 26 unknown remains. These are people that they never did figure out who they were. Bodies washed ashore for weeks, and a lot of them were identifiable, if not by features. I mean, forensic science was not terribly advanced at the time, but a lot of them were identified by what they were wearing. In one case, I remember a ring with a particular signet on it identified a person. They sometimes carried their own business cards and that sort of thing. But a lot of people were just so beat up by the ocean and animals in the ocean that they were unidentifiable. And 26 of those were buried, and you can go visit if you're in the area um, under a marker at Queen Anne's at the cemetery in the Queen Anne's area of Seattle.
Okay, so is there anything else you'd like to highlight about this story?
The only thing is that when I was an English teacher, so when I think of tragedies, I tend to think of classical tragedies, Greek tragedies and Shakespearean tragedies, and that sort of thing. And this kind of fits. But then again, I think most shipwrecks would fit into that classical tragic mold. You have a tragic hero who's sort of undone by this tragic flaw very often, and I think possibly in this case an excess of pride that sort of does him in. And I think this fits that mold. It's one of the reasons, I guess, that if my publishing company wants me to keep writing shipwreck stories, I'm working on another one now about a ship that sank off the coast of Cape Flattery, Washington in 1875. I'm not going to run out of them, and they're all depending on how compellingly you can manage to tell them, I suppose, they're all tragedies in the classic sense of that word.
Well, this has been truly fascinating speaking with you, and the book itself was just it was one it's one of those page turners. I had to read it all in one go.
Well, I'm
So
glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
and I hope that our listeners will also check it out at on your website at rodscher.com. That's RODSCHER.com. And so, once again, I'd like to thank you so much today for being with us, Rod. And I certainly will be following your exploits with the next book and further books down the line. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you again. So, thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That was a fascinating tale of unnecessary human error at sea. I had a great talk with author Rod Scher about the SS Valencia, which sank in January of 1906 in one of the most tragic maritime disasters on the West Coast. Join us next time for another Fascinated by Shipwrecks episode.
Beneath the ocean, silence sways. Lost in time, the wreckage lies. Broken masts and shattered pride. In the deep, the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out. Whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep?